Some people just don't know their place in the hierarchy. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before 100 combat veterans would arrive to prove him catastrophically wrong. Seattle General's night shift in San Antonio hums under fluorescent lights that turn skin the color of old paper. Antiseptic sharp in the air, mixing with the faint metallic smell of blood from the trauma bay down the hall. Sarah Chen moves through the ICU with the practiced efficiency of someone who has triaged battlefield casualties, though no one here knows that. Officially, the woman in blue scrubs checking for drips and charting vitals in perfect handwriting does not exist anymore. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was erased after a black op in Bagram went so wrong that the Pentagon buried everyone involved. No record. No name. No trail. Her hands are steady as she works room to room, though a slight tremor appears in her left shoulder when she reaches above her head, muscle memory from a wound that never quite healed right. She moves like someone who has learned to make herself small, invisible. She wears plain blue scrubs, hair pulled back so tight it looks like it might snap. No jewelry except a lanyard with her hospital ID photo where she looks directly at the camera with eyes that have seen too much. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. In her pocket, a tarnished military challenge coin, worn smooth from 18 years of handling. She tells curious colleagues it was a gift from a grateful patient. The truth lives in her thumb, which traces its edges during the quiet moments between patient rounds. A long scar runs down her forearm, pale and precise as a surgical line, visible when she rolls up her sleeves. "Car accident," she says. The scar tells a different story. It tells the story of shrapnel and improvised medical care and a medevac that never came. The ICU smells like hand sanitizer and something faintly sweet beneath it, the smell of people healing, or trying to. Sarah checks the ventilator on the patient in for 10, watching the mechanical rise and fall of the chest, the numbers on the monitor steady and reassuring. 78% oxygen saturation. Heart rate 62. Blood pressure holding. She moves like water, efficient and quiet, her voice soft when she speaks to patients. "Good evening, Colonel. How's the pain level? Can I get you anything?" The patients respond to her the way people do when they sense they are in the presence of someone who knows what they are doing. Someone who will not panic. Someone who has held people together when the whole world was falling apart. Room for 12 holds Colonel Marcus Davis, recovering from shrapnel injury sustained in a training accident. That is the official story. Sarah's jaw tightens imperceptibly each time she enters his room. Her posture shifts almost undetectably straighter. She recognizes him immediately, not just from the medical chart, but from 1,000 small details that soldiers carry with them. The way he watches the door. The way his hand moves to the bed rail when he hears footsteps. The way his eyes search her face the first time she introduces herself, as if checking for signs of recognition or danger. Colonel Marcus Davis commanded her son Jimmy's unit in Kabul. 18 months overseas. 18 months of letters that tried to sound normal and failed. Her son came home in a flag-draped box on a Wednesday afternoon in March. The colonel had called her personally, his voice steady, his words careful, to say that Jimmy had died well, that he had died protecting his brothers, that he had been proud to serve under Jimmy's leadership. 2 years later, the colonel arrives at Seattle General with shrapnel wounds from a training accident that Sarah suspects was no accident at all, and suddenly the universe has a strange sense of humor or cruelty, and Sarah is not sure which. She pulls the challenge coin from her pocket and runs her thumb across its surface. The coin is so worn it is barely readable anymore, but she knows every word by heart. The weight of it in her palm grounds her. She promised Jimmy she would keep the colonel safe. That was a promise made in a dream, during a moment when she was not entirely sure if she was awake or if the grief had finally broken something inside her that could not be repaired. But Sarah Chen has kept every promise she ever made, and she intends to keep this one too. Dr. Whitfield arrives for evening rounds at 6:43. His white coat is pristine. His wedding ring catches the fluorescent light as he gestures dismissively at the nurses clustered around the med station. He moves like someone accustomed to obedience, like someone who has never been told no and stopped believing it was possible. He is 52 and carries himself like a man who believes his intelligence is visible, written across his face in lines of authority. His eyes are the color of winter water. When he looks at you, you feel the weight of institutional power behind that gaze. Sarah is checking the post-op drainage on Colonel Davis's chest wound when Whitfield enters the room. The chest tube is draining clear fluid, which is normal, which is good. The colonel's vitals are stable. His oxygen saturation is rising. Everything is exactly as it should be. Sarah does not look up. She makes a note on the chart, her handwriting precise and minimal. Whitfield approaches the bed, and Sarah feels the temperature in the room drop. She has learned to read rooms the way other people read faces. The air changes when people like Whitfield enter. It becomes charged, pressurized, dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with ego. The drainage looks acceptable, Whitfield says, speaking to no one in particular. He is looking at the tube, but his tone suggests he is not entirely satisfied. Though I would prefer to see the output decrease more rapidly. Some nurses seem to think that adequate monitoring means simply watching the numbers without anticipating complications. Sarah continues charting. She does not acknowledge him. This is the safest response. Acknowledgement invites conversation. Conversation invites confrontation. Confrontation invites humiliation. She has learned this calculus over the past 3 weeks since Whitfield began his work on her. It started small. A correction during rounds about the timing of medications. A suggestion that her assessment of a patient's condition might be premature. A questioning glance when she voiced a concern about a post-op infection. By the second week, the comments had grown sharper, more public. By the third week, it was clear this was not about medicine. It was about territory. Sarah had questioned his protocol once, 3 weeks ago, when she had noticed that his post-op drain placement on another patient was positioned slightly higher than her experience suggested was optimal. She had raised her hand during rounds and asked, quietly, if the positioning might allow for better drainage clearance. The room had gone dead silent. Whitfield had looked at her the way someone looks at an insect they are considering crushing beneath their shoe. "Are you suggesting," he had said slowly, "that you have some expertise in surgical placement that exceeds my own?" "No, doctor. I was simply." "Because if you were," he had continued, his voice level and dangerous, "I would expect to see a medical degree hanging on your wall instead of a nursing license." The other nurses had looked away. The residents had turned their bodies slightly, creating distance. Sarah had nodded, made an apology, and continued her work. But Whitfield had made a note, not on the patient's chart, but somewhere that mattered. He had filed away the fact that she existed, that she had opinions, that she had dared to speak. She finishes her charting on Colonel Davis and turns to leave the room. Whitfield is still there, reviewing the chart with the exaggerated care of someone performing competence for an invisible audience. She moves past him with her hands full of empty drainage bags and used gloves, trying to make herself smaller, trying to move like someone who is not worth noticing. "Nurse Chen," Whitfield says, and his voice has the texture of a tank idling in a garage, heavy and threatening and designed to make you understand that he could crush you if he chose to engage. She stops. She turns. She waits. "I received the quarterly competency review," he says. "It appears you have not yet completed the advanced cardiac assessment certification that was due 2 months ago." "I am scheduled to complete it next week," Sarah says. Her voice is steady. Deferential. Everything he wants to hear. "Next week is unacceptable," Whitfield says. "This hospital has standards. We cannot have nurses working in critical care units without proper certifications. It reflects poorly on everyone." "I understand, doctor." "I am not certain that you do," he says. "Some people seem to believe that experience is a substitute for credentials. That working hard is enough to overcome certain limitations." Sarah does not respond. She has learned that silence is the only winning strategy in conversations like this. Anything she says will be used against her. Any defense will be interpreted as insubordination. She stands there with empty glove dispensers in her hands, waiting for him to finish. "See that it is corrected immediately," he says, and waves his hand in dismissal. She leaves. The hallway stretches before her, long and fluorescent lit and full of people moving past each other without really seeing. She deposits the glove dispensers in the biohazard bin and takes a moment to breathe. The challenge coin in her pocket seems heavier than it should be. She touches it, and the weight of it grounds her. She has survived worse than Dr. Whitfield. She has survived things that would have broken most people permanently. She returns to the med station and begins restocking the crash cart with methodical precision. Oxygen mask. Endotracheal tube in sizes 4.0 and 4.5. Laryngoscope with new batteries. The work is meditative. The work is something she can control. But that was not the worst part of what Dr. Whitfield said that evening. 23 minutes later, at 7:21, Whitfield is standing by the vending machine in the break room, and Sarah has no choice but to pass him to reach the supply cabinet. The break room is small and fluorescent and smells like stale coffee and microwave popcorn. Two residents are standing near the window, talking quietly about their weekend plans. Whitfield sees Sarah and his face changes, not obviously, but enough. His mouth tightens. His chin angles slightly upward. "Gentlemen," he says to the residents, but he is looking at Sarah. "This is actually an excellent teaching moment. You are both going to encounter nurses who believe their bedside experience qualifies them to make clinical decisions. They are inevitably wrong. The hierarchy exists for a reason. Oversight exists for a reason. You must learn very early in your careers to recognize when someone is overstepping their scope of practice, and to address it firmly." The residents shift their weight. They are uncomfortable. They are young enough to know they are witnessing something unethical, but not confident enough to challenge it. Sarah opens the supply cabinet. She removes what she needs, replacement tubing for one of the ventilators. She does not look at Whitfield. She does not acknowledge what he has said. She simply works, her hand steady, her face composed, her jaw clenched so tightly that only someone who knows what to look for would notice the tremor in her hands is not fear. It is restraint. Some people, Whitfield continues, and his voice has taken on the cadence of a lecture, simply do not possess the intellectual capacity for advancement. They reach a ceiling, and they spend the rest of their careers beneath it, resenting those who have surpassed them. It is a sad thing to witness, but it is an important reminder that credentials matter. Education matters. Proper training matters. And those who lack these things must accept their appropriate place in the hierarchy. Sarah closes the supply cabinet. She turns. She looks directly at Whitfield for the first time since he began speaking. Her eyes are the color of a stormy Atlantic. They are empty of fear. They are full of something else, something that makes both residents take a small step backward. "Will that be all, Doctor?" she asks. Her voice is quiet. Almost a whisper. The kind of quiet that makes people listen harder. Whitfield does not answer immediately. For just a moment, something flickers across his face, uncertainty, or perhaps recognition that he has made a miscalculation. Then he turns away, dismissing her the way you might dismiss a thought that is not worth keeping. Sarah leaves the break room and returns to the ICU. The night stretches before her, long and full of patients who need her and one patient in particular who needs her more than he knows. She checks on Colonel Davis at 7:42. His vitals remain stable. The shrapnel wound in his chest is healing exactly as it should. She touches the challenge coin in her pocket one more time and makes a silent promise to the empty hospital air. Whatever comes next, she will be ready. The Grand Rounds conference room at Seattle General holds 27 medical students, residents, and attending physicians packed shoulder to shoulder around a mahogany table that hasn't been polished in 3 months. Sarah stands against the back wall, her arms crossed loosely, her posture perfect but unremarkable, one of those nurses nobody quite looks at directly. Dr. Whitfield commands the front of the room with the kind of ease that comes from absolute institutional certainty. He clicks his remote. A patient chart appears on the projection screen, her chart, her documentation, her notes written in the quiet hours when Colonel Davis's monitors bleeped their steady rhythm and the hallway belonged to people who actually knew how to listen. "Here we have what I call a nurse overreach syndrome," Whitfield announces, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who's practiced this performance. The red laser pointer traces across her handwriting, isolating her words like a pathologist identifying cancer cells. "Note how our night shift nurse," he pauses, tilting his head as if searching his memory, though they both know he's rehearsed this moment for hours. "Chen apparently believes her 2-year associate degree trumps my 15 years of surgical experience. She questioned my drainage protocol yesterday during a code. Can you imagine?" The laughter ripples through the residence like infection spreading through tissue. A third-year resident actually snorts. A medical student from UT San Antonio scribbles something in her notebook. Whitfield presses on, his smile broadening. Perhaps she watched a YouTube video. That seems to be the source of most nursing expertise these days. More laughter, louder now, permission granted from the apex predator to express contempt without consequence. Sarah's jaw muscles tighten almost imperceptibly. The tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the one from a Chinook that went down in Loga province, the names of the 7 operators engraved on its edge, presses against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She forces her breathing into the box pattern, for counts in, for counts hold, for counts out, for counts hold. Her hands remain unclenched. Her face remains a mask, the kind of mask that comes from learning to hide everything in a place where showing anything meant giving someone a target. When Dr. Whitfield finally releases the room from grand rounds, when the medical students file out still chuckling at the nurse who'd forgotten her place, Sarah doesn't move immediately. She waits exactly 7 seconds, letting the room empty, letting the silence settle like dust, before she steps away from the wall and walks toward the exit with her shoulders level and her stride unchanged. The vending machine attack comes at 2:14 p.m., calculated and precise. Sarah is refilling her water bottle at the fountain adjacent to the break room when Whitfield materializes with 4 interns trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. He's holding his coffee, black, expensive, the kind that comes from somewhere that isn't the hospital cafeteria, and he positions himself between her and the exit. Speaking of competence issues," he says loudly, his voice angled so the interns can see her clearly in their peripheral vision, establishing her as the subject of ridicule before she's even aware she's being discussed. "I'm drafting a performance improvement plan for our friend here. Apparently some people think saving lives in a hospital is like, what? Playing soldier." He laughs at his own joke, and 3 of the interns echo it uncertainly, following the permission he's granted them. "Chen, remind me," Whitfield continues, stepping closer, crowding her space in a way that would be assault if the context made it assault instead of just hierarchy asserting itself. "Where exactly did you get your medical training? A weekend seminar? Some online certificate program?" One intern actually grins. Another shifts her weight uncomfortably, clearly recognizing something wrong in the scene but unable to articulate it, imprisoned by the ladder she's climbing. Sarah fills her water bottle completely. The fountain hisses as the plastic reservoir empties. She watches the bottle fill to exactly the 3/4 mark, then closes the cap with a soft click. Her hand is completely steady. Her breathing hasn't changed. She turns toward Whitfield and the interns without making eye contact, and walks past them toward the hallway. As she passes, he says, just loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That's right. Just smile and go refill the water bottles. That's what you're good at." She keeps walking. Her knuckles on the water bottle are white, but her face shows nothing. The third strike arrives at 11:44 p.m. during the exact moment when the hospital transitions from evening shift to night shift, when the senior nurses are charting and the residents are sleeping in the call rooms and security coverage shifts from strict to negotiable. Sarah is restocking the med cart outside room for 12, her movements precise and automatic, when Dr. Whitfield rounds the corner with 2 security guards in their gray uniforms, not running, not urgent, just there, a reminder of institutional power. Colonel Davis is sleeping inside the room, his medication regimen updated 2 hours ago, his vitals stable, his dreams still occasionally reaching toward the mountains of Afghanistan that his body has left but his mind refuses to abandon. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," Whitfield says, his voice carrying down the hallway where two other nurses pretend with intense focus that they don't hear him. Sarah doesn't stop counting the vials of morphine sulfate. "Gaps in your employment history. Rather significant gaps, actually. References that are vague. Institutions that won't speak to your competence on the record. It's concerning." He leans against the wall beside the med cart, arms crossed, his body language broadcasting complete ease, complete authority, complete certainty that she has no leverage, no protection, no history that matters in this building. "One more instance of insubordination, and that's what I'm calling your behavior in the grand rounds if I need to. One more time you forget your place here, and these gentlemen will escort you out of the building. Permanently. Do we understand each other, Nurse Chen?" Sarah finishes counting the vials without pausing. 32 units, each one precisely documented in the system with her name, her initials, her time stamp. She closes the med cart drawer and turns to face him. Their eyes meet for exactly 1.7 seconds. She's trained to measure these intervals, to know how long you can hold a stare before it becomes a challenge. "Yes, doctor," she says quietly, the words floating in the hallway like something disposable, something beneath acknowledgement. She returns to counting the next medication vial, her hands moving with mechanical precision, each tablet placed exactly where it belongs. Whitfield waits a few seconds, clearly expecting something more, a plea, a defense, some crack in the facade, and when nothing comes, when Sarah simply continues her work with the focused indifference of someone counting sand, he straightens his jacket and walks away. The security guards follow. The hallway settles back into its routine sounds. The ventilator wheezed in room 407, the monitor beeped its steady rhythm, the fluorescent lights hummed their electrical song at 60 Hz. Alone in the supply closet 10 minutes later, Sarah braces against the metal shelving, her hands gripping the edge hard enough that her forearms begin to shake. She closes her eyes and forces her breathing to slow, using the same technique that kept her conscious through a bullet wound in Kandahar, the same discipline that held her together when the Chinook went down and she had to choose between her own leg and the corpsman bleeding out beside her. The trembling isn't fear. Fear is a luxury. The trembling is restraint, the raw physical manifestation of power that cannot be released, fury that cannot be expressed, 23 years of operational training colliding with the requirement to accept a humiliation that would have gotten someone killed in her actual world. She touches the challenge coin in her pocket, and it's warm now from her body heat. The engraved names press against her palm like a prayer or a promise. Colonel Davis is sleeping in room 412. She made Jimmy a vow before the deployment that her son would come home to the same world he left, and when Jimmy didn't come home at all, when the convoy IED took him and 3 others just outside Lashkar Gah, she transferred that vow directly to Colonel Davis. Whatever comes next, whatever Whitfield orchestrates, whatever institutional machinery gets set in motion, she will keep that promise. She will keep that man safe. Her breathing steadies. Her hand stops shaking. She releases the metal shelving and steps back out into the hallway where the night shift is beginning, where the hospital belongs to people like her, where the fluorescent lights cast everything in exactly the same pale yellow regardless of rank or title or whether anyone in this building actually knows who they're looking at. It's 11:52 p.m. when she returns to the med cart. It's 12:08 a.m. when she checks Colonel Davis's vitals, heart rate 68, blood pressure 124/81, oxygen saturation 97%, all exactly as they should be. It's 1:34 a.m. when the first indicator arrives that the night shift is about to change everything. Rapid footsteps in the ICU hallway, wrong rhythm, too aggressive, carrying the weight of a man moving toward violence. Sarah's hand instinctively moves toward the code button under the desk. But that wasn't the worst part. The second night shift arrived like all the others, 7 p.m., fluorescent hum, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something older, something like fear that never quite washed out of the walls. Sarah's badge read RN in bold block letters. Nobody looked closely enough to see the truth underneath. She moved through the pre-shift report with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned long ago that speaking drew attention. Colonel Marcus Davis remained asleep in room 412, his chest rising and falling beneath the cardiac monitor's steady rhythm. 72 beats per minute. Stable. His left shoulder was wrapped in bandages that Sarah had changed twice since his admission 4 days ago, shrapnel wound from a mortar round that should have killed him, and probably would have if he hadn't been standing beside a master chief who knew field trauma medicine better than most emergency physicians ever would. Sarah kept the challenge coin in her scrub pocket. She touched it once as she entered the colonel's room, a habit so automatic her own hand barely registered the movement. The metal was cold. Worn smooth on one side from a decade of hands holding it through impossible moments. She checked his full line, normal saline running at a steady drip, no infiltration, no signs of infection at the insertion site. Everything was exactly as it should be. The colonel's eyes opened slightly as she adjusted his pillow. "How are you feeling, sir?" Sarah's voice came out level, professional, the voice of a nurse with a few years' experience and nothing remarkable to distinguish her from the 1,000 others in 1,000 other hospitals. "Like I got hit by a truck," the colonel said, his speech still slightly slurred from the pain medications. "Your boy Jimmy. You know him." "I knew him well, sir." That was the truth compressed into 5 words. Knew him. Past tense. The boy who'd been alive and laughing in her kitchen 2 years ago, who'd gone back to Bagram with the colonel's unit, who'd come home in a flag-draped box with a letter of commendation and a military photograph that looked nothing like the young man she'd raised. "He spoke highly of you." The colonel's eyes closed. "Good CO looks after his people. It's what you do." He drifted back toward sleep, his hand unconsciously reaching for the call button. Sarah made a small adjustment to the 4-pump and left him to the night, closing the door softly behind her. In the hallway, the hospital breathed its quiet rhythm, monitors beeping in distant rooms, the occasional page overhead, the distant sound of shoes on tile floors. She had checked on 3 other patients and was approaching the nurse's station when the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened with a pneumatic hiss. The man who stepped out wasn't in a hospital gown. He wore street clothes, jeans, a dark hoodie pulled low, and he moved with the jerking, purposeful gait of someone running on adrenaline and anger. Sarah's threat assessment was instantaneous, hands clenched, breathing elevated, eyes fixed on a single destination. Room for 12. His voice, when he started speaking, was a raw scrape of fury and broken things. "Marcus Davis." Not a question. A curse. "Marcus Davis in this hospital. Thought you were dead. Thought Bagram took you like it took everybody else." Sarah moved. Not toward the alarm. Not toward security. Toward the man, her hands visible and open, her voice dropping to the frequency that had talked panicked soldiers through arterial bleeds and made helicopters divert from safer landing zones. "Sir, I need you to step away from that room. You don't know what he did." The man's hand emerged from the hoodie pocket and Sarah's muscles recognized what her eyes already knew, the dark metal shape, the angle of his grip, the way his shoulders tensed for the recoil. "You don't know what happened in Bagram. What he ordered us to do." "I know," Sarah said, and she kept moving. "I was there." The confession hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Not long enough. The gun rose and Sarah's body remembered everything her mind had spent 2 years trying to forget. The muscle memory took over. The predator instinct. The master chief who'd been buried so carefully under scrubs and humility and the deliberate smallness of a woman who'd learned that invisibility was survival. She moved not away from the gun but into its arc, her hand coming up to redirect the barrel even as the first shot erupted like thunder in the narrow hallway. The bullet tore through her shoulder, white-hot and screaming, and kept going through the door frame behind her. She didn't scream. Didn't fall. Her other hand struck the man's wrist in a move that broke his grip on muscle memory rather than technique, and he fired again. The second shot caught her abdomen, below the vest line where no armor existed, and the world briefly tilted. Pain was information. Pain was data. She catalogued it. Entry wound left of midline, approximately 8 centimeters from the anterior superior iliac spine, probable penetration of small intestine, significant bleeding already starting in the peritoneal cavity. Her hand stayed steady. "Colonel Davis," she called out, her voice unchanged, hit the panic button. The third shot came as she moved again, placing herself fully between the gun and the door. This one took her in the chest, high and to the left, and she felt the sharp punch of a rib fracture as the bullet transited. Pneumothorax developing, she could feel the air beginning to accumulate in the pleural space, that sickening sensation of her own lung beginning to collapse as it pushed away from her chest wall. She was still standing. Still moving. Still thinking in the clinical, detached way that separated adrenaline from fear, that made soldiers function when everything in their body screamed to stop. The fourth shot caught her side as she lunged, and the fifth followed almost immediately, his hands shaking now, his breathing ragged, his rational mind finally catching up to what was happening. A woman was absorbing bullets like she was made of something harder than flesh. A woman was stepping toward him even as blood soaked through her scrubs in widening stains that looked black under the fluorescent lights. A woman was still standing between him and the door. Sarah's vision was beginning to tunnel, the blood loss accumulating faster than her body could compensate. She could hear the alarm now. Colonel Davis must have finally found the button, could hear the distant sound of running feet, the shouting of staff somewhere in the building. But in this moment, in this hallway, there was only the man with the empty gun and the woman bleeding out on the tile floor. She took one more step toward him. Then another. He ran. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her, felt her knees finally acknowledge what her mind had been ignoring. She was down, her back against the cold floor, her chest feeling like it was filling with something that wasn't blood. The taste in her mouth was copper. The fluorescent light above her face seemed impossibly bright, impossibly steady. Hands were on her now, Rodriguez, the night tech, his voice somewhere distant and clinical. Gunshot wounds. Multiple entry wounds. We need a trauma team now. More hands. More voices. They were cutting away her scrubs, and she was trying to form words, trying to give instructions because the colonel had a reactivated wound and he needed pressure applied in exactly the right spot or the bleeding would resume, and she'd promised Jimmy she would keep him safe. Tourniquet, she whispered. My left leg. Femoral compromised. They lifted her onto the stretcher. The movement sent white pain through her entire body, but her hands moved on their own, fashioning something from her torn scrub pants, something that would hold pressure on the bleeding vessel until they could get her to the trauma bay where proper equipment existed. Rodriguez stared at the improvised tourniquet, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. She wasn't a nurse who happened to know about tourniquets. She was someone who'd made emergency improvised equipment while lying on a stretcher, while bleeding out, while thinking about someone else's survival instead of her own. Tell the colonel, Sarah managed. Upper right quadrant. Pressure there. He'll understand. They were running now, the stretcher moving fast enough that the world became a blur of tile and fluorescent light. The trauma bay doors burst open and the controlled chaos of emergency medicine took over, Dr. Patel's voice calling out numbers, a resident cutting away the last of her clothing, someone inserting a large bore into her neck when they couldn't find a usable vein in her extremities. The monitors were screaming their electronic alarm, and someone was saying BP 70 over 40 and dropping, and someone else was saying she's got a pneumothorax, left lung completely collapsed, and Sarah was still conscious, impossibly conscious, her eyes tracking the movement of people and equipment around her with the precision of someone trained to remain aware under conditions that would have rendered ordinary people unconscious. A chest tube went in, she felt the pressure, the sensation of a needle sliding between ribs, the release of pressure as the accumulated air rushed out in a hiss that sounded like someone exhaling after holding their breath for too long. O2 saturation climbed. 72. 83. 91. The physical sensation of her lung re-expanding was almost as bad as the collapse. Dr. Patel's hands were moving with precision, calling for blood, for type and cross, for the rapid infuser to push fluids into her failing circulation faster than her heart could pump them out. And then another voice, familiar and cold, spoke from somewhere near the foot of the stretcher. What's her status? Dr. Patel, still working, answered without looking up. 47-year-old female, gunshot wounds to shoulder, abdomen, chest, and flank. Already lost substantial blood volume. Pneumothorax on the left, successfully re-expanded. Probable penetrating trauma to small bowel. She'll survive if we can stop the bleeding, but it's close. Another 5 minutes in that hallway, Anne. I'm suspending her effective immediately. Dr. Whitfield's voice cut through the medical urgency like a scalpel. Pending investigation. She engaged an armed threat instead of following evacuation protocol. Dr. Patel's hands paused for exactly 1 second. She saved a patient's life. She violated hospital safety policy. Whitfield was already moving away, already reaching for his phone. I want this documented. Someone get me her complete employment history from her previous facilities. I'm contacting the board tonight. And get risk management on the phone. We need termination procedures initiated immediately. Sarah's vision was beginning to fade now, the blood loss finally catching up to consciousness, the medication for sedation pulling her under like water. But in that final moment of awareness, she understood what was happening. The gunman had tried to end her with 5 bullets. Dr. Whitfield was going to finish the job with a personnel file and a phone call. She'd been erased once already, by the Pentagon, from a classified operation in Bagram that had gone so wrong they'd buried everyone involved. Now she was going to be erased again, by a hospital administrator who saw her as nothing more than a liability in scrubs. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Whitfield's voice, still on the phone, still building his case, still convinced that he was the most dangerous thing in this building. He was wrong about that. But he wouldn't understand until it was too late. 36 hours. That's how long Sarah's body took to remember what it meant to be broken. She woke in a private room, courtesy of Colonel Davis, she'd learn later, with her right arm immobilized in a sling that felt like a concrete cast, her chest wrapped so tight each breath came as a negotiation with pain. The 4 in her left hand had bruised the vein dark purple. Her mouth tasted like pennies and old blood. A trauma surgeon named Dr. Kelly stood at the foot of her bed with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting death for 4 straight minutes. Your lung re-expanded this morning, he said, checking the chest tube drainage. We removed 2 of the bullets. The 3rd one's lodged near your T8 vertebra. We can't touch it without risking paralysis, so it stays. He paused, letting that settle. You lost 3,400 milliliters of blood before we got you stabilized. We transfused 8 units. Your spleen was shattered, we had to remove it. Sarah nodded once, processing. The body was a machine. Damage assessment was just data. Pain was information. The collapsed lung was the critical factor, Dr. Kelly continued. When the bullet pierced your pleural cavity, air entered the space between your lung and chest wall. Each breath you took compressed your lung further. You should have lost consciousness in 30 seconds. Most people do. He leaned against the rail. You stayed awake for 4 minutes while you talked Colonel Davis through applying direct pressure and applied a field tourniquet to your own leg. You coached him on artery pressure points and blood volume management. You knew exactly what you were doing. Sarah said nothing. There were things she couldn't explain. You should be dead, Dr. Kelly said quietly. I've been doing this for 22 years. You should be dead. The door opened before she could respond. A woman in hospital administration, ID badge reading Margaret's lease, risk management, entered carrying a folder. Behind her came 2 security personnel Sarah recognized from the day shift. Master Chief Chen, Solis said, pulling up a chair with the precision of someone delivering bad news in a hospital. She'd clearly been briefed, but not on everything. Dr. Whitfield has filed a formal incident report regarding your actions during the shooting. He's requested your immediate suspension pending investigation. Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The machines tracked it, heart rate climbed from 68 to 74. His statement indicates you engaged a threat instead of following evacuation protocol, Solis continued, reading from the document. Hospital policy in active shooter situations is mandatory evacuation to designated shelter areas. Dr. Whitfield documents that you were aware of the protocol but chose to position yourself in the line of fire. That places liability questions on the institution. I was protecting my patient, Sarah said. Her voice came out hoarse from the tube they'd threaded down her throat. "That's not in question," Solis replied, and something in her tone suggested she actually meant it. "The question is whether your intervention was appropriate under hospital policy versus individual heroics that endangered your own life and, potentially, your patient's safety." Whitfield's report frames it as insubordination with lethal consequences. The words landed like shrapnel. Insubordination. That was how he was framing it. Not bravery. Not sacrifice. Insubordination. Dr. Kelly stood. She saved that man's life. If she hadn't. "I'm aware," Solis cut him off gently. "But the legal exposure is significant. Until we can determine whether there's any breach of protocol, we need to place her on paid administrative leave. Full investigation, outside firm doing the assessment, standard procedure." Sarah closed her eyes. She'd seen this before, different uniform, different country, but the same institutional dance. Erase the person. Sanitize the narrative. Protect the hierarchy. 2 hours later, while she was still processing the suspension, a nurse brought her a phone message. Dr. Whitfield had called the board. 3 calls, actually, to 3 separate board members, each one a partner at different law firms, each one owing Whitfield professional favors from years of consulting gigs he'd steered their way. By evening, an external risk management firm called Premier Risk Solutions had been contracted. They were bringing in an investigator. They were requesting her complete personnel file from Seattle General, every shift she'd worked, every patient interaction, every minor complaint that might have been filed over the past 3 years. They were also requesting her work history from the VA medical centers in Bethesda and San Diego, and from Walter Reed. Sarah understood what was happening. Whitfield wasn't trying to win a policy dispute. He was building a termination case. He was going to crawl through every hospital system she'd ever worked in, every patient, every day, and he was going to construct a narrative of a dangerous operative masquerading as medical staff. One person making wrong calls. One person who couldn't follow protocol. One person who needed to be removed before she got someone killed. The challenge coin sat on her bedside table, and she stared at it between doses of morphine that made the world float at the edges. She was discharged against medical advice on the morning of day 3. Her doctor recommended at least 4 more days of observation, but Sarah's savings, even after 12 years of nurses' wages, wouldn't cover extended hospitalization without hitting her reserves, and the looks from the phlebotomist and the night shift aide told her Whitfield's narrative was already spreading through staff like a virus. People were choosing sides. The administration side was winning. A discharged nurse helped her into clothes that had been brought from her apartment. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else. The bandages wrapped her torso like a corset made of gauze and crushing weight. Her right arm hung useless, the sling supporting it like a sling supporting the dead. The November rain came down in sheets when she left the building, and Sarah didn't bother opening an umbrella. The water soaked through her jacket, ran down the bandages, and she didn't feel it. Pain was information. The rain was irrelevant. She drove to a 24-hour diner on the south side of San Antonio, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights had burned so long they turned a sickly yellow, and where the coffee always tasted like it had been brewing since 1987. The parking lot was empty. The night shift had ended. The morning shift hadn't begun. She was suspended between worlds. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Dottie, poured her a cup without asking. Sarah sat in a booth by the window, her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass outside. 3:59 in the morning. The world was asleep. The hospitals were quiet. The soldiers were in their bunks or their homes or in the ground, depending on luck and caliber and whether the medic had gotten there in time. Her reflection was a stranger. Hollow-eyed. Gray-skinned. The kind of person who existed in the spaces between things. Not quite dead, not quite alive, not quite anywhere specific. The challenge coin sat on the table next to her untouched coffee. She turned it over and over in her left hand, the edge catching the yellow light. De represso liber. From oppression, liberation. The words had meant something once. They'd meant everything once. But that wasn't the worst part. Somewhere in this city, in that hospital, Dr. Whitfield was making calls to attorneys. He was constructing documents. He was turning her act of sacrifice into a liability, into insubordination, into the reason she needed to be erased from Seattle General the same way she'd been erased from the Pentagon records for years ago. She'd survived Bagram. She'd survived a classified operation that went so wrong the military buried everyone involved. She'd survived being told her service never happened and that Sarah Chen was a civilian now, forever. And now she was going to lose her job for saving someone's life. The newspaper someone had left behind showed a small article wedged between a city council scandal and an obituary section: hospital nurse injured in ICU shooting, suspect in custody. 2 sentences. No name. No mention of what she'd actually done. No mention of the fact that she'd stayed conscious through catastrophic blood loss and coached a man through saving her own life using knowledge she technically wasn't supposed to have. Sarah picked up the newspaper and read those 2 sentences again and again, looking for herself in the words. She wasn't there. She was never there. She was the person who did the thing, and the thing got written about, but the person disappeared. The waitress came by with the coffee pot. Sarah gestured her away without looking up. She didn't need coffee. She needed something she couldn't name. Something that felt like the opposite of invisible. Her phone was on the table, powered off since the hospital. She didn't turn it on. There was nothing there but messages from people explaining why she'd made the wrong choice, people defining the parameters of her own sacrifice for her, people writing the narrative she was supposed to inhabit. She turned the challenge coin again. The reflection in the diner window showed a woman who'd been shot 5 times and survived, who'd saved a colonel's life, who'd applied a field tourniquet to her own leg at 3 in the morning in a hospital hallway while her body was trying to die. A woman who'd been trained by the best warriors in the world to handle exactly this kind of crisis. A woman who was about to be fired for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. The trembling started then, not from fear or pain but from something deeper, the controlled, measured fury of someone who'd learned that the worst battles didn't happen on foreign soil. They happened in fluorescent-lit hallways and administrative offices and in 3:59 a.m. diners where nobody knew who you were because you weren't allowed to be anyone. She pressed her left hand flat against the table, forcing the trembling to stop. Discipline. Control. The mask held. It held until she realized that nobody was watching anymore. The mask had kept her alive through situations where being seen meant being killed. But in this yellow-lit diner, alone except for a waitress who didn't know her name, the mask was just another form of death. The morning news came through her hospital room television at 6:24 a.m. Sarah sat up slowly, her left shoulder wrapped in surgical tape that pulled at the skin underneath, and watched her own face fill the screen. Military dress uniform. Hair pulled back tight. The woman in that photograph was someone else, someone the government had officially erased in 2015 when the Bagram operation went catastrophic and the Pentagon decided that all evidence of her existence should vanish into classified files marked Operation Blacklight, Personnel Casualties, Eyes Only. The headline crawled beneath her image: Missing Decorated Combat Medic Surfaces After Classified Operation, Pentagon Confirms Identity. Her hands went steady. That was the training. The body remembered what the mind tried to hide. She reached down to her scrub pocket where the tarnished challenge coin sat, somehow still there after 5 bullets, after surgery, after Dr. Whitfield's venom, and let her thumb find the worn edges. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in the lobby of Seattle General to collect the personal items from her locker. A cardboard box sat on the discharge table, already packed by someone, her stethoscope, the spare badge, a paperback novel she'd never finished. The box felt lighter than it should have. Everything important had already been taken or had never belonged to this version of her life. That's when she heard the footsteps. Not the shuffling of visitors or the purposeful stride of nurses changing shift. This was different. This was synchronized. Boots on linoleum, echoing through the corridor in perfect formation, growing louder, closer, the way only military units move when they're not trying to hide their presence. Sarah's body tensed, not fear, never fear, but recognition. The tactical part of her brain that had survived Bagram, that had dragged wounded men through fire, that had held arterial bleeds with bare hands while rounds snapped overhead, that part was suddenly, acutely awake. The lobby doors opened. 100 combat veterans filed into the atrium in formation. Not quite perfect, this wasn't active duty anymore, but close enough that civilians stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped everything. The elevator doors froze mid-close. A child pointing at a toy went quiet. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that felt suddenly unbearable, like the sound of authority recognizing authority. They wore everything from fatigues to jeans to business suits, but every single person wore the same expression, a kind of reverent intensity that Sarah recognized immediately. She had worn that expression herself, standing in front of someone worth dying for. A man stepped forward from the front rank. Lean, scarred across his left cheek, eyes that had seen deserts and darkness. She knew him immediately. 5 years ago in Helmand province, his leg had been partially severed by an IED blast, his femoral artery spraying like a cut hose. She'd used her teeth to tear open the tourniquet pouch while applying direct pressure with her other hand, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her ribs, refusing to let him die. He saluted her. Not casual. Not modern. The kind of salute that belonged to a different era, the kind that said, "I would follow you into hell." "Artemis," he said. His voice was like gravel. Like a tank idling in a garage, engines running hot. The security guards, the same two who had stood silent while Dr. Whitfield threatened Sarah with expulsion, snapped to attention. One of them spoke into his radio, voice shaking slightly, "Master Chief on deck." The phrase hung in the air like a detonation. Sarah felt it move through the lobby like a shockwave, felt the civilians turn, felt the power of a title that should have been dead and buried with classified files. A 3-star general stepped forward from the middle of the formation. Dressed blue so sharp they could cut glass. He held a folder, worn leather, stamped with the Pentagon insignia. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind of voice that had ordered men into harm's way and lived with the consequences. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," he said. "Bronze Star." He paused. The lobby held its breath. "Silver Star." Another pause, longer this time. "Second Silver Star." His eyes found hers. "Navy Cross." 47 combat saves. 15 direct actions. 0 casualties under your command. Each decoration hit like a round going down range. Sarah felt them land, felt the weight of them, felt the years of silence collapsing into this singular moment where all those invisible missions, all those classified deaths prevented, all those names she carried in the dark part of her memory, they were real. They were documented. They mattered. Colonel Marcus Davis stepped forward. He was supposed to be 3 weeks from discharge, still moving slowly, still favoring his left side where the IED fragment had lodged. But he moved with the precision of a man reclaiming territory. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who had commanded hundreds. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Sarah, "took 5 bullets meant for me. 4 in the shoulders and chest, 1 in the abdomen. The gunman fired at point-blank range. She stepped between us anyway." He paused, and his voice dropped lower, rawer. "In Bagram, I watched her save lives while bleeding out herself. I watched her perform a field tourniquet on her own leg while talking me through emergency pressure dressings on my own wounds. That's not nursing. That's not protocol. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." Sarah felt something in her chest shift. Not pain, she'd learned to live with pain 8 years ago. Something else. Something like the moment a held breath finally releases. The applause started quietly, then built like thunder. 100 combat veterans clapping in absolute synchronization, the sound like rainfall on a metal roof, and then one by one they saluted, the same deep, irreplaceable salute the SEAL had offered. Sarah saw tears on some faces. She saw the hard-eyed stares of people who understood what it meant to see someone finally recognized after living in shadow. And then she saw him. Dr. Whitfield stood on the second-floor mezzanine overlooking the lobby, gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping him vertical. His face drained from its usual confident pink to something closer to ash. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without sound emerging. Sarah watched him process the formation below him, the general, the cameras now arriving through the lobby doors, because of course the news had picked up the story. The hospitals in San Antonio had their own reporters. The story of a hidden combat medic shot 5 times was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The CEO of Seattle General stood beside him now, phone pressed to her ear, her expression the precise color of fury that preceded termination. What Dr. Whitfield didn't realize, standing there in that perfect suit with that perfect posture that had made him feel untouchable, was that his own investigation, the one he'd launched to destroy her, the one where he'd pulled every favor and called in every board member, had triggered automatic alerts when it touched military databases. Those alerts had reached the Department of Defense within hours. And the DoD audit team that arrived to assess classified exposure instead found something far more useful: the altered surgical reports, the meticulous documentation of falsified complication rates, the side consulting business where Whitfield sold patient outcome data to malpractice insurance companies for between $20,000 and $40,000 per file. The web expanded. The board members he'd called in favors from, the ones who had agreed to help him destroy Sarah's career, turned out to have financial ties to Whitfield's wife's medical supply company. The contracts steered toward her business were worth millions. The investigation that was supposed to end with Sarah's termination instead revealed a systematic pattern of corruption that made the hospital's liability lawyers start making phone calls that lasted until 3 in the morning. Board member Hutchins resigned within 48 hours, his statement so terse it might have been written in Morse code. Recent developments have brought certain conflicts of interest to my attention. I am stepping down effective immediately. The CEO personally delivered Whitfield's termination letter by Friday afternoon, flanked by 2 attorneys in the kind of formal procession usually reserved for executions. The state medical board opened a full investigation into falsified surgical records. 6 families came forward claiming Whitfield had lied about complications that killed their relatives. His malpractice insurance carrier dropped him with a letter that used the word uninsurable 4 times in 2 paragraphs. His wife filed for divorce when reporters showed up at their home asking about the financial ties to her medical supply business. The hospital settled for wrongful death lawsuits in a single week, each one naming Whitfield specifically, each one a public acknowledgement that he had falsified records to hide his own mistakes. His attorney negotiated the surrender of his medical license in exchange for avoiding criminal charges, but the civil suits would drag on for years, each one a small death, each one a reminder that the man who had stood in front of 27 medical students and called her nursing a form of overreach was now fighting for the right to practice medicine anywhere on Earth. 2 months later, Sarah moved through Seattle General's night shift with the same practiced efficiency she'd always maintained, but now the tarnished challenge coin hung openly on her lanyard, catching fluorescent light as she checked vitals in the ICU, as she reviewed charts in the nursing station, as she walked between rooms where veterans waited for her expertise. The hospital had created a new position for her, veteran liaison and trauma specialist. She consulted on cases involving military patients, trained staff on combat-related injuries, bridged the impossible gap between civilian medicine and military medicine. Room for 12 held a young Marine with blast injuries from Syria. Sarah reviewed his chart, checked the pain medication dosage, morphine 4 milligrams for every 6 hours, with PRN fentanyl patches for breakthrough pain, and when he woke confused and reaching for weapons that weren't there, she was there with a calm voice that made his hands lower. "You're safe, Marine. You're home." He focused on her lanyard, on the coin-catching light, on the small Special Forces patch she now wore openly on her scrubs. "Master Chief," he asked, and his voice cracked the way voices crack when they find solid ground after drowning. "I've got you," she said. Through the ICU window, visible through the glass doors to the parking lot, she could see Dr. Whitfield sitting at a folding table in a strip mall between a tax preparation franchise and a dollar store, wearing a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo embroidered over the pocket. He was trying to interest passing shoppers in supplemental coverage policies. A woman pushed past without stopping. A teenager took his flyer and dropped it 3 feet later. He checked his phone obsessively, his shoulders hunched in a way they never were when he wore the white coat that had made him feel like God. Sarah saw him once, briefly, when she was leaving her shift at dawn, stepping out of the hospital doors into the pale San Antonio light. Their eyes met across the parking lot. He looked away first, shame and fury warring on his face in equal measure. She felt nothing, no satisfaction, no pity, just a distant recognition that consequences eventually find everyone, that the hierarchy he'd spoken about so confidently always inverted when people finally understood the real power structure. Colonel Davis visited monthly for follow-up appointments he probably didn't need, always finding Sarah to talk about his son Jimmy's upcoming deployment, to share coffee in the cafeteria, to salute when he thought no one was watching. The veteran security guard still called Master Chief on deck when she arrived for night shifts, making her smile despite herself, making her remember why she'd kept that challenge coin for all those years in silence. In the supply closet where she used to hide her breathing exercises and trembling hands, she kept a small photograph now, her unit in Bagram, faces she could finally remember publicly, people she could finally mourn without fear of betraying herself. She touched the challenge coin on her lanyard and thought about those years of pretending, those years of being unseen, and felt something like peace settle into her bones. As she passed a mirror in the hallway during her night shift, her reflection looked solid, real, present. She spoke quietly to it, a private acknowledgement that belonged only to herself. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And she returned to her patients, finally visible, finally whole, finally home. If Sarah's story moves you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, or if you know someone serving in silence, waiting for recognition that might never come, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. The quietest people often carry the heaviest loads. Let's honor them together. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to discover you were dead wrong?